So hi everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the very important topic of sexual harassment. DV Connect has been providing information right throughout October as it's Sexual Violence Awareness Month. If you'd like to have a look at our social media accounts, then there's a heap of information there. Firstly, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we live and work. For us, that is the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and I recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their past and present elders. My name is Julie. I've been working in the role of Community Engagement and Development Coordinator for about a year at DV Connect. My academic background is in psychology and counselling. I've worked in domestic and family violence and in sexual violence concurrently for 15 years, both frontline and managing a team. I'll hand over to my colleague Steph to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, so I'm one of the crisis intervention counsellors here at DV Connect. So I've been working in domestic and family violence for 2 years as a crisis counsellor. I've been working as a sexual assault counsellor on our sexual assault line here at DV Connect for 1 year. My academic background's in disability, community services and development, and social work.
Thanks, Steph. So just a quick note, if anyone feels that they may need any additional support, there's some phone numbers that we'll have in the chat there. And just also before we start, a bit of a disclaimer. So today, this is just a general awareness session. DV Connect can't provide any legal or industrial advice. We're just talking about sexual harassment and general awareness of it, and giving some sources of where people can find further information or support if they need to. So we'll get started introducing DV Connect just briefly. So while we're predominantly perhaps known as a domestic and family violence service, we also provide sexual violence assistance. In the 2019-2020 financial year, we had around 140,000 calls, which averages out to 1 call every 4 minutes. We are a statewide provider across the whole of Queensland, and 41% of people accessing our services were from regional and rural remote areas. On average, we also provide 15 children safe accommodation away from violence every night. So I'm going to hand over to Steph to talk a little bit around our services.
Thanks, Julie. So as Julie mentioned, we do have a couple of programs that we support women and children with, and men across Queensland. So we have the Women's Line, and that's a 24-hour service, and we provide emergency accommodation, safe accommodation 24/7. We provide referrals to refuge, and we support women with travelling to safe friends and family. We work with women around safety planning, information and referrals, and emotional support, brief emotional support. We also have a Pets in Crisis program. So through that program, we work with the RSPCA, and what they do is they support women with fostering their animals while women and children access the refuge. We have the Men's Line, which is counselling and referrals for men who are either using violence or experiencing violence. And we also have the statewide sexual assault line. So that's another information and referral service. We provide brief counselling on that line as well, and support in for people who are needing sexual assault support in their local area. And yeah, I think that's on to you, Julie.
Thanks. Today what we're going to do is talk about the definition of sexual harassment, some of the stats that are associated with that. We're going to have a look at who is affected by sexual harassment, what some of the behaviours are, what it looks like. We'll talk about, importantly, the impacts of it, the respect at work report, and how employers can create that safe and inclusive workplace. And then at the end, we can answer some questions. So the definition for sexual harassment is there, and it's so sexual harassment is unlawful under the Sex Discrimination Act 1984. The definition there is quite wordy. Sexual harassment is defined as an unwelcome sexual advance, unwelcome request for favours, or other unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature in circumstances where a reasonable person, having regard to all the circumstances, would anticipate the possibility that the person harassed would be offended, humiliated, or intimidated. So that really wordy kind of definition there basically comes down to that behaviour that is of a sexual nature that could cause offence or harm is what we're talking about. The United Nations considers sexual harassment to be a form of sexual violence as well.
So the 2018 National Survey provides a clear picture of the pervasiveness of sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. So the results indicate that 33% of people who had been in the workplace in the last 5 years have said that they've experienced workplace sexual harassment. So that's 1/3 of people who've been in the workforce, and that's far too many. Women at 39% were more likely than men at 26% to have experienced workplace sexual harassment during this time. If we consider the stats for sexual violence, 1 in 5 women have experienced sexual violence compared to 1 in 20 men. So when it comes to violence of a sexual nature, then we can see it's predominantly women who experience this. However, this is not a women's issue because it's actually up to everybody to end this. Workplace sexual harassment was estimated to have cost the Australian economy approximately $3.8 billion in 2018. So while the effect on the individual is significant, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, it's important that we also recognise that employers are also impacted. As a country, sexual harassment and the associated negative impact on individuals, employers, and the economy affects all of us, either directly or indirectly. Thanks, Julie.
So if we go back to that definition, then we can see that basically it comes down to behaviour that's inappropriate for the workplace. It's behaviour that's not wanted and which may even continue even after perhaps asking that person to stop. Breaking down the behaviour, it could be physical things such as, touch that's like brushing up against someone. It could be intimidating someone by blocking them from leaving a room or hugging someone when that's unwelcome. It could be verbal, so comments about someone's appearance or inappropriate questions such as, asking about their underwear or about their sex life or something that's really inappropriate in the workplace. It may be things in the environment like a calendar of, naked people. It may also be, done with a technology base, such as like an explicit picture or a video that's being circulated amongst work colleagues. So all of these behaviours that are not welcomed or invited by the person experiencing them, sometimes the behaviour, it can be quite obvious or it might be quite subtle. It may occur in front of other people or it may be in private, but that person experiencing it is likely to feel uncomfortable, anxious, offended, powerless perhaps, and maybe embarrassed. And hopefully, other colleagues can pick up on that behaviour that we might see and hopefully, check in with that person, say something like, hey, are you okay? If we're seeing these behaviours. That was covered perhaps more in our last webinar. So that's something that you should check out if you haven't already had a look. So if we go on to where does it occur? So So we're talking about those usual work hours, and that's probably the thing that I would imagine, most people would think of, those 9 to 5 kind of hours. But it's really important to note that sexual harassment can occur not only then, but also other times, such as, a weekend away at a conference, or someone maybe visiting a client, or at, even at a workplace Christmas party, something that's outside of the workplace. But basically anywhere, if the reason that you're there and associated with that is that it's to do with your work. I'll hand over to Steph to talk about some of the groups that may be more likely to experience it.
Thanks, Julie. So sexual harassment can affect anyone, but we know that there's groups of people that research has shown that could be more likely to be affected by sexual harassment. And those groups are workers that are under 30 years old, those who identify within the LGBTQ+ community, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people living with a disability, workers from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, migrant workers, or workers holding a temporary visa, and people who are in less secure working arrangements. So when a person belongs to a number of these groups, for example, an Aboriginal person who is living with a disability, who is also a casual worker, that increases their chances of being affected by sexual harassment even more. So what are the impacts of sexual harassment? So sexual harassment can cause physical and psychological harm, not only to the person directly affected, but to others in the workplace. For example, a person witnessing the behaviour. Sexual harassment can lead to a range of problems such as feeling isolated, a loss of confidence or withdrawal, physical injuries, stress, depression, anxiety, and PTSD. All of these can affect a person's mental health, relationships with others, and their performances at work. These negative impacts can be short-term, but they may also last well into their future, affecting them for many years. Thanks, Julie.
So as well as affecting workers, sexual harassment can have a really large impact on the employer as well. And this is perhaps something that if I think about, people discussing sexual harassment previously, perhaps not haven't focused on this as much, the impact on the employer. And it's mostly seen around a loss of productivity and engagement, perhaps increased staff turnover. Overall, it can have a really negative impact on the workplace culture, and it can also increase the demand on resources for the organisation or business in terms of responding to complaints, litigation, and also, very importantly, the reputation of the business or organisation. So if an employee, feels that their workplace is unsafe, a place where they can't go and do their work and have a normal kind of friendly interactions with others, then that place becomes threatening or anxiety provoking. They may be, driving to work crying, having panic attacks, feeling that kind of awful pit in the stomach. It may trigger symptoms of depression and anxiety, or it may exacerbate these existing conditions if they already have had them. People can also experience, physical symptoms from stress, such as headaches, muscle aches, high blood pressure, insomnia, to name a few, all of which may impact on the person's work and potentially leading them to take more sick days off. There also may be, more than one person affected in the workplace, so that impact can be compounded across the whole workplace. So if we have a talk about the Respect at Work report, that was done in June 2018 against the backdrop of a momentum of the Me Too movement, and in recognition of the prevalence of and immense harm caused by sexual harassment in workplaces. The Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins, and the Minister for Women, the Honourable Kelly Dwyer, announced the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces. The Australian Human Rights Commission was tasked with undertaking this inquiry. So if I just read out from the report for a moment, overwhelmingly, the Commission heard that the current system for addressing workplace sexual harassment in Australia is complex and confusing for victims and employers to understand and navigate. It also places a heavy burden on individuals to make a complaint. Most people who experience sexual harassment never report it. They fear the impact that complaining will have on their reputation, their career prospects, and relationships within their community or industry. Throughout the inquiry, the Commission heard of the need to shift from the current reactive, complaints-based approach to one that requires positive actions from employers and a focus on prevention. So, if we're talking about if we go back to the drivers of sexual harassment, where does it occur? So it's driven by gender equality. So rigid gender roles and stereotype constructions of masculinity and femininity. And this kind of translates into the, into employment and, firm gender roles in the workplace. People thinking of, women in the workplace as less than men. And if we think about, often at the very top ladder in many businesses and organisations, those higher levels are quite heavily populated by men, according to research. So, and I might even go so far as to say, older men who've perhaps had years working during previous times when these behaviours involved in sexual harassment were more normalised in the workplace, where there was less of a culture of calling out the behaviours. So there may be workplaces where the policy is in place, but the general culture of the workplace is kind of condones sexual harassment. So there may be an incongruency there as well. If we go to talk about Queensland, it's also covered in the Anti-Discrimination Act. So if sexual harassment happens in the workplace, an employer may be legally responsible for their employees, unless reasonable steps are taken to prevent it from happening. Employers need to protect their staff from sexual harassment and other types of discrimination and make sure that their workplaces are free of this type of behaviour. This may include having a policy about sexual harassment and making sure that all employees, especially the managers and the supervisors, are trained in how to reduce and prevent incidents from happening. And employers should also have an effective, good process for dealing with complaints. Talking about, a safe and respectful culture and what does that look like? So we can provide transparent, easily accessible health and safety policies, procedures on what to do to report an incident, and then process around confidentiality and privacy for people, and taking a stand. Like, this is a really important thing, I think, is taking a stand against sexist images and language in the workplace, to kind of have that culture where people feel that, it's safe, it feels safe for them, and that they can be themselves and can go to work, do their job as they need to do their job, interact with colleagues without those feelings that we talked about before, feeling intimidated or anxious or scared about going into that workplace. Also offering training on how staff members can take bystander action against sexism. So that's, calling out if you see something, that is inappropriate, or, that could be offensive or harmful towards someone, to call out that behaviour. Also think about for leaders to think about having information that they can put around the place on where people can go for help. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Have that culture that's not perpetuating this, so the culture that's not letting this happen, because then it becomes normalized, and it becomes something that's just how it is here, and that's what we don't want to see. We want to stop that. For people who are leaders in workplaces, to have time to also critically kind of reflect on their own behavior. Are there stereotypes and discrimination happening around their workplace? The leadership styles that they value and promote, is that favouring men over women? Also, do you exclude, undervalue, or fail to credit women's leaderships or opinions in your communications and decision making? So having a critical eye on that stuff. Using communications to challenge stereotypes and help employees see the correlation between gender equality, sexual harassment, and violence against women, that those things at the start promote or allow that environment where violence and sexual harassment can occur. Okay, I'll pass over to Steph to talk about some of the places that people can get assistance.
So for assistance or for further information, there's just some services and supports up on the screen here, just to have a look at. So these avenues for support are geared somewhat to an individual seeking assistance, but some of the suggestions, such as Fair Work, are for employers too. So this is also information that an employer can make available for their staff, in order to further demonstrate supportive workplace culture, as Julie was talking about, by providing these options to staff. Thank you.
Okay, so we have, so DV Connect provides workplace training in domestic and family violence. And we have in development a training on sexual harassment, which expands on some of the concepts and things we've talked about today. So it's sexual harassment and sexual violence. So we're offering all attendees 10% off that training using that training code that you see on the screen there. And that's valid for 4 months. So if you're interested, please get in touch. We're happy to just, talk things over, have a chat around what might work for your workplace, and arrange things to hopefully get that done. So we've just got a few questions that have come through. So if a member of my team tells me they've experienced sexual harassment in the workplace, what should I say to be supportive from the outset? So one of the very important things, I think, in sexual violence is believing people. There's often a lot of perhaps shame and stigma around sexual violence and sexual harassment, and probably one of the big barriers is people feeling like they won't be believed. So believe it first of all, and then you can just validate that that must have been that's difficult, or that sounds like you've been through a really difficult time. And then I think it's appropriate to talk to people around what would you like, how can I support you. You can say I've just done a training around sexual harassment and sexual violence. I have a bunch of options. Would you like to have a look at having a further conversation with someone? Would you like me to assist you to or go with you to talk to HR or something, whatever their choice may be. So letting them lead what they would like to do, then it's their they've had the courage to talk to you, then let them decide what they would feel comfortable with. And often, I think in sexual harassment and sexual violence, people have felt powerless at times. So it's allowing them to make their own, their own decisions and choices that suit them at the time. Another one, can women be sexually harassing at work? Yeah, absolutely. We saw in the stats earlier that it can be, something that affects all genders and all sexualities. And women can absolutely do this. I think the key thing, though, is that if we have a look at the research, as Steph outlined earlier, that it's predominantly women who do experience sexual harassment, and those groups that we talked about earlier, such as Aboriginal Torres Strait Island people or people with a disability, those groups predominantly. What can I do as an employer to ensure my team feel comfortable coming to me with complaints? I think it goes back to, reflecting on your own behaviour as a role model. And if you are supporting equality, and if you are calling out, behaviour perhaps that you, don't want to see in the workplace, and maybe if you have, information around for people, then people see that you're someone who's aware of this and someone who is, kind of aware of all the issues and concerned about, sexual harassment, and that you are, a safe person to talk to. So I think that, that goes a long way to kind of letting people feel that it's okay to speak out, that this is, that I can do that.
Julie, I was just wondering, do you have any suggestions on what an employer could do if they were concerned or had any suspicions that there was sexual harassment occurring in the workplace? Maybe what strategies that they could implement?
Yeah. I think one of the kind of, I guess, easy ways to do it that doesn't single anyone out in particular is to, resend out a policy on sexual harassment and just say, we've been reading over and having a look at this, or rewording it, and just want everyone to pitch in with some thoughts here. Or, just want to, it's that time of year where we resend out policies. Just everyone, can you just refresh your memory on this? So just general sending information out. It could be that you find some of the information on sexual harassment or sexual violence and pop that up in posters, maybe, in common work areas, so that people can see them there. Some of the places that you can call, like the sexual assault line, or perhaps 1-800-RESPECT, have their information and details around. It's also, I think, maybe inviting a discussion with team leaders, like, we've been, sexual harassment in the workplace has been a fairly topical discussion lately. So just want to invite everyone to, send thoughts and ideas, or how we may do better in our workplace, or support everyone to feel like they can come forward if they need to. So so I think those are generally fairly easy ways that we can send out a message that everyone gets the same message, and it's not singling out any one person. It's a general message for everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks. Is there any other questions that anyone has? Okay. All right. Looks like no more questions in the chat there. So I would like to thank Steph for assisting me today and talking about this topic. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. Thank you so much. And we hope that you'll be in touch about some training, or just want to have a discussion around that. Please get in touch. And don't forget all those helplines, DV Connect helplines, should you need pass on any details to anyone. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.